Hello everyone, welcome to the July 2020 Food Thinkers, where we bring together big ideas from women in academia, policy, business and advocacy on redesigning food systems. I must apologise for the late start of our event today. I'm afraid that technology got the best of us this time. So I hope that you're still with us. I know that we had an amazing amount of interest in this webinar and many people registering to join. So welcome and thanks very much for joining this Food Thinkers webinar on reframing the obesity narrative in the wake of COVID-19, placing people at the centre. And I'm delighted to welcome Johanna Ralson, CEO of the World Obesity Federation, to give our Food Thinkers webinar today. Just to say, before I introduce Johanna, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available online afterwards via our YouTube channel. With regard to questions, please put these in the Q&A. And Johanna may also be pointing you towards asking some questions throughout the talk. If you want to tweet, you're very welcome to. It's the Food Thinkers hashtag and the handle is Food Policy City. And they'll also be displayed on the screen following their presentation. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Johanna Ralson. She will be known to many of you as a really important leader in obesity and non-communicable disease prevention globally, with over 20 years of experience. And part of that experience has been a lived experience of having an NCD herself, a subject on which she's written very eloquently and spoken about, which is one of the aspects of her experience which leads to the topic of this presentation today. Prior to joining the World Obesity CEO in 2017, she was the CEO of the World Heart Federation and Vice Chair of the NCD Alliance. She is a prominent voice internationally, serving on advisory boards and expert groups for the World Health Organization, World Economic Forum, the Lancet, and elsewhere, speaking at events with heads of state and ministers of health. She's alumni of the Harvard Business School and has studied public health at Harvard and Johns Hopkins. So welcome, Johanna. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today. And with no further ado, we look forward to hearing your talk. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Corinna. Can you hear me now? Is everything fine now? Okay,
good. Hear you.
I just do want to thank everybody for hanging in there and staying on. We're really touched that you have remained on patiently while we worked through some issues with Microsoft Teams. I'm not going to do any product disparagement yet, but it's sometimes a little bit of a challenging program, and we had to do several things, and eventually, partly helped by Corinna's daughter, I'll say, we were able to find a workaround to make it work. So thanks very much. And I'm really delighted to be here. I think Corinna herself and the Center for Food Policy are just some of the leading thinkers in this space of food policy broadly and sort of the links to health. And in particular, I want to note that one of the many things I appreciate about Corinna herself is how much she focuses on lived experience. Intuitively, it seems like we should be, thinking about the people who are affected by policies, and perhaps they should be involved at the outset and not at the end of a long process. As Alapia Samuels on the World Obesity Federation board says, let's try to think of people as subjects rather than objects. So that is part of, I think, the obesity narrative topic that I'll be covering today. I want to say briefly, and I know we have less time, and I'm very anxious to hear from all of you, so I'll probably go through my slides a bit more quickly than I might have otherwise. But I did want to actually mention this very interesting experience with the importance of narrative. As it so happens, as an undergraduate in university, I was an English major. I love language, but the importance of narrative in health is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, because I've been working in NCDs for a long time. And one of the many reasons I was so excited to come work in the obesity space, because I sensed that obesity was struggling with narrative. But what happened was it was in November 2016. I was in a meeting sitting next to somebody at a luncheon and said, he was a health economist. And I said, well, you're a health economist. How would you explain Brexit? And perhaps also a recent presidential election that had just happened. These seemed, you know, surprising. How did this happen? And he said it was narrative. It was, you know, Brexit, in the Brexit case, it was having a narrative that was very galvanizing and compelling, simple, strong. Brexit, that's a very robust, muscular kind of term. But, you know, take back our you know, take away the sense of disempowerment we've had, take back our power. Remain is a very kind of passive word. It doesn't mean that that narrative excuses not having the right evidence, but it does mean that narrative plays a really strong role. And so I sort of had this insight, and I said, does that mean sort of Brexit was, in some senses, narrative without evidence, and then Remain was evidence without narrative? And my colleague agreed. You can put that, you can think of many things that have gone on in the world that have a narrative that isn't necessarily accompanied by evidence, but also many great and important projects get waylaid or not deprioritized because their narrative is struggling, even though they have all the evidence in the world. So I think what we need to do is, of course, marry evidence and narrative. That's where we have a win. And in the case of obesity, the evidence is overwhelming on so many fronts, even though we have new evidence unfolding every day, as we're particularly seeing in the case of COVID-19. But the narrative has probably been a bit of a struggle, and so I'm going to speak to some of the wrong narrative, some of the recommendations of narrative, and keep moving forward. Elaine, because we're in this slightly hybrid arrangement, Elaine is going to forward slides for me, so I'll say next slide, please. If we could. Great. So just briefly, some history. There has been obesity in some way, shape, or form for many years. The notion of body mass index, of sort of the conversion of height and weight to start to try to measure it, so not just a pure weight measure, was pioneered by Adolf Quetelet in the 1860s. But this idea really more in looking sort of at what does the average human look like, and there's been these sort of outlying individuals. You know, there's always been some level of sort of significant overweight or obesity existing in the world. What is interesting is what's been happening in the last few decades. Next slide. So while we go through, I'm actually going to ask you, and I'm really going to ask people to write answers to these questions in the Q&A box, because I really want to hear from you, and then Corinna will be pulling some of your questions as well as your answers. And so first of all, I want to ask if you think that there is an obesity narrative. I think I've said maybe, maybe not. I'd like to hear if you believe there is an obesity narrative. If there isn't one that's sort of compelling and unifying, why would that be? Okay, so if we can just keep on, you know, that's just something for you to keep in mind, and I'd ask you to answer that. I'll ask you probably about 4 questions that I'd really welcome your thoughts on. So again, global obesity, there's 2 billion adults with excess weight. If we look at the number who are considered classified as obese of children and adults, in adults that means measured with a BMI of 30 or greater. Childhood obesity is measured in slightly different measures. That's close to 1 billion. So 1 billion people are living with what I believe is a disease, and yet, you know, there's in some ways not more uproar over this. There's a recognition of it, but not necessarily a clear narrative, a clear sense of why, of what to do. There's certainly a number of 4 million deaths a year associated with excess weight, mostly NCDs. There's a very high prevalence of childhood obesity, and it's increasing. And if you take the numbers that McKinsey came up with about 6 years ago, the cost is about $2 trillion a year. Now we're hearing $1 trillion a lot in the world today, in the COVID world, but it's still a lot of money. Next slide, it's going to just be a quick animation. And I think just to note as well, we had the wonderful launch of the sort of the food security index on Monday, and you know, and even Secretary General Guterres of the UN said, you know, obesity is such a critical issue. At the same time, food insecurity across undernutrition and overweight and obesity is a especially pressing in this time of COVID. So childhood obesity, if we look at where it was in sort of the 1960s to the 1990s, most countries are still in that sort of, you know, there's a few that are sort of surprising that still had a quite significant prevalence of childhood obesity. But for the most part, we were really seeing, you know, in that sort of 10 or 5% or lower rate, or many countries had no measures whatsoever. Now, let's go to more recent years. Next slide, please. And you see that we've gone from blue to red, and I think they're countries that are really important to think about and note. So China, you know, China, Brazil, almost all of Latin America. I mean, yes, US we know about, Mexico we know about, but you know, Australia was on the low end in between the 60s and the 90s, and has now become a country where there's, you know, 25%. And I'm using childhood obesity, childhood overweight and obesity, just as one of the many ways to describe this challenge. But many countries in the world have now really tipped over into 15, 20, 30, you know, 25, 30%. And in some of the Pacific Islands and some of the Gulf regions, even above that. So we've just seen this shift. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, and I think just to restate that again, so we see, you know, significant now overweight in a country like Ethiopia. If you look at the green circle here, certainly the largest number of children with overweight or obesity in the world, we're seeing it's in places like China. And even India is starting to come up, because even though it's still around 5%, it is 5% of a very large population, and they have the unusual challenge of the double burden, because they continue to experience major undernutrition among children as well. Let's keep going. And yet, how are we seeing childhood obesity described? You can click so we see the animation. And the next picture as well, please. Thanks. We're still seeing it. So this picture on the left is very recent, and it's meant to be sort of this is sort of you know, meant to be almost a medical description of childhood obesity on the left, and yet it's a picture that's very, very I think indicting the child is maybe how I would put it, in terms of sort of it's all about children just eating too much unhealthy snacks, and if they didn't, well, wouldn't that be great? Even some of the words used here, sort of, you know, pot belly, binge eating, it's all about some sort of behavior on the part of the individual child, as opposed to the notion that actually that child is growing up in an environment in which options for healthy eating are severely limited. And then, of course, on the right, these are famous pictures of, you know, McDonald's, and it speaks to the obesogenic environment that that child is living in. And in fact, when we start to analyze it, what kind of options are there beyond sort of particularly unhealthy food? But in any case, there's a strong sense of sort of shaming here, and I think it's part of the picture of why it's been so hard to get the obesity narrative down, and people with obesity are extraordinarily stigmatized and marginalized or misunderstood. Next slide. So, and then we can, if you can click so that we can also get the picture here, which is more stigma. So, sorry, if we can go back, thanks. Again, adult obesity, the figures are the same in terms of, you know, or the problem has grown in similar ways. So it has grown very significantly since sort of the 1980s. And while in some places there's been a plateau or a downturn, the rate of increase is startling in terms of the countries like Laos and Vietnam, where prevalence has been low, but the rate is increasing rapidly. And different countries have different thresholds. There are sort of standard measures, but then you have some different ways of measuring, you know, even different thresholds for BMI in Asia, for example. So there's a lot of disagreement about the best optimal measures. Is BMI right? It's a bit like our calories, the best way to be measuring health in a way, you know, lack of or excess of, because calories themselves are perhaps also, I think we know, not the right measures, not adequate for sure. So this just describes, again, and on the right, I just want to speak to, this is part of the narrative, and again, narrative is both words, but it's also pictures. The kind of narrative that we see a lot, and that we at World Obesity, many of our colleagues in the obesity community, and then many, you know, now thankfully WHO has also been very supportive of this. Let's not use these pictures that somehow treat this as some sort of, you know, dysfunctional, behavior on the part of an individual that leads to obesity, when in fact, and let's not show pictures of sort of headless bodies that are very kind of shaming. If you'll recall, the very first picture in this slide series, I won't go back to it, showed a woman with obesity sitting at a table, working, looking happy. I think it's really important to understand there's 1 billion people with obesity. We all have family members, friends, loved ones, that showing people in a very respectful and positive light is not only the right thing to do, but the accurate thing to do in terms of lots of people with overweight and obesity living also productive lives. So this very stigmatizing imagery is again part of the problem of the narrative, if you will. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, and again, some of these trends that reinforce, this is on the left is the US, on the right is the world. And in the world, it's total BMI above 30. And then for women and for men, sorry, that's I think in Dutch. But it shows, again, that this has been something that's been fairly, it's not just been a high income country like the US, it's actually been all around the world. This trend has been going on, and a lot of it seems to be have had a bump and an increase in the 1990s. So really, in our recent memory, which is again, at least in my recent memory, which is again one of the reasons it's also very challenging, and that's because it's in certain respects it's massive increases of more recent phenomenon. So we are uncovering as we go, which, to speak to the COVID piece, is there's new data coming out every day, new studies, new assessments, starting to kind of create that cumulative effect of enough studies to say clearly there is obesity is on its own and not associated with any comorbidities a risk for complications of COVID. And so it's gone from the anecdotal to the evidence and now sort of the cumulative evidence, and we're very eager to see it more explicitly referenced in national guidelines and in WHO recommendations as well. Next slide, please. So here's also that, in the recognition that obesity was a challenge, there have been a series of obesity-related targets that the UN and WHO have or the World Health Assembly have endorsed and supported and adopted in the past, sort of over the last decade, that's been focused on NCDs, and in the decade of action on nutrition, so between the UN and WHO. So for WHO, there has been the sort of NCD action plan adopted in 2014. There was or 2013, after the UN high-level meeting on NCDs in 2011. One of the targets was a 0 increase in adults and childhood obesity prevalence by 2025. And then for the SDGs, there was through SDG 3.4, 1/3 reduction in premature non-communicable disease mortality by 2030, which has also, obesity as one of the sort of indicators to arrive at that number. And then SDG 2.2, while SDG 2 is largely focused on hunger, again, it's about the sort of the target underneath the goal is around ending malnutrition in all its forms. And that, again, language is important. This idea that malnutrition does not just mean undernutrition, it means all of it. It means undernutrition, it means excess weight and overweight. Although, again, also obesity is not just a matter of overnutrition, it's got a more complex sort of set of drivers than that. And then also the WHO Commission on Ending Childhood Obesity, which was in 2014. So let's keep going. So you'll see for World Obesity Day in 2020, on March 4th, 2020, we did an analysis of how are we doing on the 2025 global targets. So again, those are the ones about sort of a 0 increase in obesity prevalence by 2025. How are countries doing? Next, if you can click so we can show that, yeah. Countries are not doing well. They are, South Africa is a typical one. Essentially, we did an evaluation of likelihood of countries to achieve that target and sort of overall obesity prevalence. This is available on worldobesity.org, so please do find it. It's called the Missing Targets Report, and it has a report card for every country in the world. And it's very telling, not just about obesity prevalence, but also rate of increase, which is a very alarming number. South Africa is a great example of a country with very high prevalence among women in particular, I was lucky to hear Sandhya Singh from the Ministry of Health of South Africa speak yesterday about how obesity is really becoming such a prominent challenge during COVID in South Africa, and thankfully there's governmental support for more prioritization of that. But this is key. And again, one could go back to the original target was in many ways an unrealistic target, which if there's time to talk about that during the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss in more detail. But I think it was quite a political target, and I'm very glad it's there. Sometimes it's almost better, and this is a question I'd have for you, if you would agree with this. Do you agree it's better to have a target you won't reach than one you will reach, because which gives you in some ways more political momentum to make noise. So no country in the world, I could almost guarantee, and I don't know, maybe not, but that will likely reach that that sort of 2025 target. I think Malta, no, I'm sorry, not Malta, Andorra has women in Andorra may reach the target, as I think, you know, one of the findings of our report, or have a better than 50% likelihood or something. Still, we're not going to get there. Next slide, please. So then if you look at this is we've said, well, and this was people like Corinna were really helpful as we created our new 5-year plan with our, you know, fantastic obesity organizations who are members, and then our partners and allies working all around the world, to say what can we do to help reach these targets, what role can we play, how can civil society in particular come together, what common narratives do we need. And indeed we published a paper in Lancet around this called Time for a New Obesity Narrative, which came out, I think it actually came out in about a year and a half ago, and really saying we need to be talking about obesity differently, using different words, different images. Next slide, please. So if you can just click through so that we get to the whole timeline. So this sort of shows if we want to get to sort of 2030 and some meaningful plateauing in obesity, what are some of the things that have happened and what needs to happen? If you look at the upper side of the timeline, this shows some of the UN and WHO activities that have been going underway since 1999 actually, and they relate to obesity in terms of being, tobacco is very instructive, so in terms of being somehow similar multi-sectoral complex issues, and then the broader NCD agenda, and places where tobacco can potentially have models of success and models of effectiveness, or where obesity itself is going to be touched on. So the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, in an interesting way, is instructive for some of the issues, multi-sectoral challenges and drivers, the role of trade that obesity is now facing. And so can we learn from tobacco? I think we have. Many brilliant people who used to work in tobacco now work in obesity, which is really encouraging. And then some of the things that on the yellow side, things that civil society and others have been sort of involved in helping to shape. So again, in 2010, 2015, with the UN high-level meeting on NCDs and the political action plan, we did have obesity included as a target, as well as an indicator in the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition. There was a high-level meeting on NCDs in 2018. We were able to get some wording in on obesity into that. The high-level meeting on UHC was interesting because obesity was not explicitly referenced. There was really hardly any disease or health issue that was. But several, I was struck by the number, I was fortunate to be able to attend, a number of heads of state spoke about it. Just as many ministers of health speak about obesity, because everybody needs help, doesn't quite know what to do. Now in 2020, we've seen with COVID that there's NCDs and national guidance plans, and in many of them now, an increasing number, we're starting to see obesity referenced as, you know, risk populations. We've seen this in Mexico, in Peru, UK, a few other places. As we go to 2021, we have further opportunities around the high level, the summit on nutrition, and then the Nutrition for Growth meeting that was supposed to happen in Japan this year and has been delayed. From our perspective, we wonder if an obesity resolution might be a catalytic event. We would not certainly see that happening in 2021, but might be something one could work towards. And then we don't know is the answer to where obesity will be, but we will make every effort to ensure that we have a common narrative and start to make things happen. Next slide, please. I am conscious. So if we look at this, you can click through to show each of the Thanks. So again, all of a sudden we're now in this COVID world, and have now, obesity has emerged as an independent risk for COVID complications. We also saw in places like states like Louisiana in the US, which has very high obesity prevalence, including among younger ages, no surprises there, that younger cases in the US were associated with obesity and with inequity, because again, as you know, the US is also associated with equity issues. I will say I moved back from 9 years in Switzerland to be living in the US this past year, and it's been a very, very interesting year to be here, a very interesting year. And I just hope and trust that we build back better. So obesity hasn't really been in WHO recommendations, although it's at the national, part of national guidance. So we do hope and work closely with our friends and colleagues at WHO who are working in many different areas around physical activity, nutrition, NCDs, diabetes, all the different places where obesity is a challenge. And again, in many places now, it's seen as one of the pre-existing conditions, which is in and of itself a tricky term. And as somebody who lives with, as some of you know, I live with MS. I have my entire adult life, and also have had cancer. That pre-existing conditions can be a sweeping term that can sometimes be a bit dismissive. Early on, the language around pre-existing conditions for COVID was very concerning, and that does still persist to a certain extent. Some idea that if a person had a pre-existing condition, they were less, their life, the potential loss of their life due to COVID would be less impactful. Or valuable. So I also point out that we have more of a policy dossier on COVID and obesity on our website that is collecting a lot of the great information from all over the world. Next slide, please. So, and again, this was Guterres yesterday, which is why I mentioned it, but that we're seeing, also because rates of obesity are overweight and obesity are so high around the world, we anticipate that we will have a high percentage of people who will have complications of coronavirus. Will also have a BMI of over 25, and then there certainly have been challenges presented by people with severe obesity, which is the population most likely to be in the ICU, who or to require specific extensive care and be hospitalized, intubated. That intubation of the patient with obesity can sometimes be a challenge. Issues of just essentially hospital beds, how to manage a person living with obesity are very complex and requires specific training and recognition of the challenge. If we could go to the next slide, please. So why is it increasing, and what story are we telling? I'm just going to quickly go through these because I do want to make up for lost time and also hear from all of you. So again, I think it's a problem of narrative in many cases. In one respect, it's because obesity in certain respects is more recent than some of the other established NCDs. It was not included as one of the 4 main risk factors or 4 main diseases. So it wasn't the 5x5 or the 4x4 that WHO in the NCD prioritization process was focusing on. So while it's so widely prevalent, it hasn't sort of been one of the top priority NCDs or risk factors, because again, and this gets to one of the other issues which is that for the most part, even in early papers with WHO, there was acknowledgement that obesity probably was a disease. There seems to be even further kind of recognition of that, but also a risk factor. So it's been seen as both. It fits all the sort of profile and criteria of a disease, and yet it also is a risk factor. And so, like diabetes, it's both. That can sometimes diffuse its seriousness or make it unclear where it should be prioritized. There also has been a bit of a tendency, which is human nature, to have single silo solutions to complex cross-cutting issues. Obesity is not just about, it certainly is about excess calories, but it's about much more than that. I'll speak a little bit to that later. And also, I think what's been increasingly obvious after a number of years now of public efforts to to intervene in multiple ways on obesity. It's that no one solution is going to be the best answer. It requires sort of coordinated action across multiple domains. There also, I have to say, has been documented both provider bias as well as a bias towards prevention. And I'll just say something a little bit here about my own experience as a patient. Is sometimes I've always sat in the NCD world where you have treatment and you have prevention, and then you have lots of different things and people in between. As a person living with a condition or a disease of MS, you know, and having done so for my entire adult life, it's interesting because when the talk just lands on prevention, it can be very frustrating and very, in some ways, alienating, because it's somehow focusing just on one element of it. And then we certainly saw this in tobacco control as well. You know, isn't it our responsibility to give people who already have potentially, you know, crossed a line into a disease state the same care, attention, and prioritization as those who have been fortunate not to have gotten ill yet? So there's sometimes a bit of a bias there. It's also easier. Prevention feels easier. There's also provider bias as well documented in obesity, and I think that's partly because it hasn't really been understood what it is in any kind of complex, meaningful way. The understanding of its role in metabolism, its effect on leptin, etc., are more recent discoveries, and so many providers don't necessarily receive training. A person rarely goes to a healthcare professional with obesity. They go with a complication, a comorbidity, diabetes, something else. So it's not really, it sits everywhere and nowhere in the health space, in the health system space. And so that bias, though, is very solvable through education, through understanding, through increasing recognition and evidence. And then also the lived experience piece, because there's been so much bias against people with obesity, that has in turn made it harder probably for people with obesity to be able to be champions. I don't think I've been flabbergasted at times by the amount of sort of judgmental and stigmatizing language that's been used, or the trolling. I have a disease that's easier to hide, and I feel very, very sorry for, I feel very, very sad how challenging this is. Also, I'll just mention, I had a stepbrother with obesity who had it as a consequence of anti-schizophrenia medication, which is, there's quite a bit of obesity that's due to sort of side effects of medication, etc. And I saw the pain that he went through for that. And he eventually died quite young of a heart attack that was associated with all these factors. So, and the other piece is actually farm subsidies. One of the theories is farm subsidies were accelerated dramatically in the US in particular, but certainly also in the EU in the 1970s. That led to the diversification of large-scale crops, the industrialization of crops at a much higher level, and the availability of cheap foods, which in turn were produced in ways that were much less healthy than what they replaced. So interestingly, the farm subsidies in the 1970s in particular may play more of a meaningful role than we understood. Next slide. So changing the words, if we could just do the next. So here's sort of the language we have now. Obese person, that's an obese person. The word malnutrition has been somehow associated with undernutrition. So issues of obesity, overweight, and poor nutrition, particularly in low and middle income countries where malnutrition is more of a challenge, have been somehow lost, and the recognition of this has been hard to classify. The word fat carries a lot of negative associations. Condition, thin. If we can go to their preferred opposites on the other side. So if we can say a person with obesity, just as we would say a person with diabetes or a person with cancer, we speak to malnutrition in all its forms, and see ourselves as part of a tribe working together. Adiposity is more of a medical term. Disease rather than condition is sometimes helpful, and then healthy weight, because you can actually have much improved health even if you a person with obesity only lose, you know, sort of 10% of your body weight. You can actually be much, much healthier. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, and again, changing the images. So here on the right, we have some slides of sort of people in Brazil, in the UAE, you know, living meaningful, active, positive lives, not sort of pictures of them sort of eating lots of unhealthy foods with the heads not shown. On the left, I'm just showing an example. Is at World Obesity Day, we worked with our colleagues from Europe, the US, and IASO and TAS and others, as well as all around the world, colleagues in the Caribbean, to try to find, is there one single image? And we struggled a bit. Is there one image that works? In some countries, the cutout that you see, that sort of second from the right, is seen as very dehumanizing, and yet in that particular one is from the Gulf, where they liked it. They felt they didn't like the human form. That, you know, so there's lots of different views. There's a lot of different ways of expressing this, and I think it speaks to so much we don't know what we don't know about how to have different parts of the world are most comfortable sort of describing the person with obesity, because I think that image is going to be very, very important as we come up with our common narrative. Next slide, please. There's also all sorts of bias. So Marion Nestle has points out quite wisely, it's much easier to find industry-funded studies with favorable results than not. And by that, she means food industry. I think the word itself, industry, though, I've always had a little bit of a concern with, because industry includes the health industry, and there's lots of good things going on in the health industry, many of which I'm a direct beneficiary of, so I'm biased myself. Also, the food industry, there's lots of good things going on there. I sometimes think I have said this before, we need to take a look at that word industry and decide if that's the best way. Are we not missing some subtleties and nuances of all the different actors involved in the food space? Because a small shareholder farmer is private sector, but not at all in the same way that a large company might be. Could we go, there's just a couple more comments here. And again, provider bias is one of the issues that we've seen. So people with obesity not getting the help they need because healthcare professionals often don't quite know what to do with them, or they've had these earlier attitudes of being quite judgmental, not understanding that there's a physiological change that's going on, how complex obesity is. Next bullet, please. Policy prevention of bias, as I mentioned, and then finally, we could just, patient bias. So two others. So patient bias is, again, that internalized shame, that desire not to be a patient, which I can certainly identify with. And then cultural preferences. We know, our colleagues in Jamaica talk about fluffy women as a positive attribute. In many places, there's a preference for people with heavier weight. It implies success as well. So there's a lot of different pieces to this language. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, and policy inertia, because I think in part civil society hasn't been that cohesive around obesity, and it's nice to see that changing, because there's some remarkable advocates and experts and scientists doing great work. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then within the NCD world, we're also seeing inherently obesity, to the extent it mostly sits inside NCDs, although it somewhat sits with nutrition, but neither are particularly robustly funded areas globally. In NCDs, you can see on the left, the level, the DALYs are the sort of percentage of global health funding is the dark blue, proportion of global health funding is the dark blue, proportion of global DALYs is the light blue, meaning that, so disease burden, if you will, for NCDs in general, which for the most part obesity sits within, is overwhelmingly it's what is the biggest burden of disease worldwide, and yet funding for it has been minuscule in terms of philanthropic or development funding. Not to have a contest, but HIV funding, and this slide is a few years old, but the proportions are still pretty similar. HIV funding is almost the opposite, and that's, again, NCDs themselves, including obesity, have sat in this very blame the protagonist kind of mindset that has taken a long time to change. Next slide. And then, just as a reminder, exercise sometimes, quite unfortunately, the sugary beverage industry has said exercise is our way out of this, and has somehow tried to to make the case that you know, exercise is going to be the thing that's really the big issue. That's not. And there's a lot of, this is a wonderful, quite public-facing, easy-to-read piece that describes why you can't exercise your way out of obesity, although, or even just general weight loss alone. But although it plays a very important role, not just in mental health, but also in weight maintenance when there has been weight loss. Just a few different points. So if we can go to the next slide. And again, so one of the biggest challenges is the complexity. Spaghetti charts, as we call these. This is from the Foresight report that looked at sort of all the different systems, in a way, involved in obesity. It's quite striking that a systemic issue like COVID-19, which is kind of revealing and unmasking weaknesses as well as strengths in our health systems, our political systems, our social systems, is also correlated with obesity, which itself is a very systemic issue, which has been, I think, part of the narrative and an increasing understanding of obesity in recent years. But this just, again, looks at all the different drivers, education or built environment. It's not just food, and it's not just a matter of eat less, move more. To address obesity, it requires this complex interplay of different systems. Next slide, please. So causes and culpabilities. So I think just before, just to kind of boil it down into that narrative, I think that the narratives that have not worked try to make the person with obesity in some ways, or try to make it that there's a villain, this sort of simplistic causal model that blames it on the individual who's weak, who's lazy. It's their fault. And then there's also, in some ways, an overly victimizing narrative that sort of says it's all the food industry has done this to us. It's all that. It's nothing else. And you know, in some ways, taxing and restricting or is all we need. You know, those are sort of two maybe overly simplified narratives. Now, if we can just click through the next bullets. And so that shows that there's this complex interplay, as we saw in the Foresight model, between factors that aren't necessarily within the individual's control. Epigenetic factors, so factors about what the mother ate while pregnant with the child, etc. Biological, psychosocial, and then wider environmental factors, which are again also often out of the individual's control, but which are what's described as the obesogenic environment, what kinds of food are available, the built environment, etc. So all of these things lead to stigma, discrimination, shame, people with obesity being delayed in getting help, not being able to access help when they need it. And certainly that extends beyond just health services into employment and education, and so it only exacerbates the problem. It also, again, undermines individual agency, which is very much part of the solution of a positive narrative. Next slide, please. So the one solution to obesity is, and this is from Harry Rudder, there is no one solution. He published a paper on this a few years ago that essentially said the one solution to obesity is there is no one solution. And I think this is the key, and a narrative needs to understand this. It affects people of all ages, geographies, socioeconomic backgrounds. The misleading obesity narratives, I should say, they've gotten in the way of coordinated action, although we do see excellent work at city levels where it's easier to coordinate. And in smaller countries, I guess I should say, that are not necessarily like some of the small island developing states dependent on trade, having such a high association of trade and food. But again, it's a risk factor and a disease, a complex chronic disease. I wanted to mention Germany just formally recognized obesity as a complex chronic disease, and that I think is a victory because that helps take it out of this sort of personal blame narrative. Are there concerns that medicalizes it? Yes. And should it be medicalized to a certain extent? Yes. So I think that's what it is. But I think it's good news from our perspective. I think it's an important next step. Next slide, please. And so some of this too is about the word obesity has become so loaded, and we've had conversations with some of our colleagues in very interesting parts of the world about wanting to kind of proudly use the word obesity. At World Obesity Day, we were using kind of this O model. We had Zuleika Mandela there, because she certainly understands the challenge of obesity. Some of our colleagues at the NCD meeting in Sharjah, we even had Helen Mirren was supportive, etc. But reclaiming, in some ways, taking good good, good advocacy 101 is take the word that your opponents are using against you and use it for you, because in many ways obesity has become, in certain places, a really negative word. Impressionism, I listed that example. Impressionism was actually an insult to the original paintings. Oh, these are just impressions of paintings, they're not paintings. And so the Impressionists took that word and said, okay, yes, we're Impressionists. Let's go. Now to the next slide, please. So again, I just have a couple, I think 4 more slides. Lived experience is an incredibly important part. Back to Corinna, her great work in that area. She's been looking at what is the experience of school children who bypass what's available in their school and go off site to eat unhealthy products at a store. Some of it has to do with how they're treated by the people who work at the store versus the people who are working in the cafeteria, for example. I mean, just really basic things, but that are part of the whole complex picture of how people interact with the food and wider physical environment. Words and images that are translatable across cultures. This is no easy matter, but we just have to keep on working at it. An interrelated set of approaches, recognizing that the only solution is that there is no one solution. Next slide, please. And so for World Obesity Day, we did have an image where we said, if people understand the concept of roots. Obesity itself has many roots. It's food, it's mental health, genetic risk, it's the role of marketing of unhealthy products, but it's also things like healthcare access. In certain places, it's sleep. All these different factors that feed into the one person who may or may not currently appear to have at an unhealthy weight, but either has been in the past or is placed at increased risk because of how these different roots play against each other. The next piece of it, next slide, please. And then we came up with sort of a solution, which we said was ROOTS, the acronym. One thing I've learned is that acronyms are a great way to translate complex processes, particularly in World Health Organization. For example, EMPOWER is an acronym for 5 measures around tobacco control. The HEARTS package is also an acronym for measures to address cardiovascular disease that WHO uses and that countries report back on. So sometimes an acronym can be helpful. So these are some of the elements. All of this is saying is that there's lots of different things that need to happen in order to effectively address obesity, and no one organization, individual, or sector can do all of them, but everyone can agree they all need to be done. And so that's we had people signing on to our Roots Declaration as a way of reinforcing that. Next slide, please. So there's 4 dimensions that we think to the sort of the narrative. Again, recognizing that obesity requires multiple discrete actors and sectors to work together simultaneously through many entry points, and it's going to vary geography to geography. Changing words and images to shift blame away from individuals towards upstream drivers, but not diminishing the role of individual agency and the individual having a seat at the table and a role to play. Obviously, childhood obesity is a massive issue, and very much one in some ways that ministers of health in particular can get political support for and need political help with and technical help with, and that is an entry point to the wider interventions around obesity, and then recognition of it as a complex chronic disease, not just a simple risk factor. Next slide, please. So, and then finally, just the syndemic, the global syndemic of undernutrition, obesity, undernutrition, and climate change was our Lancet commission from about 1.5 years ago to really look at how systems dependent obesity is and solutions to it are as well. I think it really says a lot that a commission on obesity decided to focus on these wider issues. We believe this has in many ways been validated by what we're experiencing right now. We're also encouraged that there's lots of things going on that are kind of in the spirit of the syndemic in terms of double and triple duty actions to affect climate change as well as food systems. They may not be called sort of syndemic per se, but it's a really important concept or framing device or way of thinking about it as we continue to refine the obesity narrative. Can you go to the next slide, please? And then as a reminder, we can skip to the next slide, but just malnutrition in all its forms includes it looks different in different parts of the world, but in all parts of the world there is malnutrition in all its forms. And so let's also just see ourselves as part of that cohesive whole as well. Next slide, please. And so that's all. I think that's the key. Those are the points I wanted to make. I hope this was helpful. I do want to say we had a, despite the, COVID becoming a, sort of arriving in sort of February and March as we were lifting off for our first really new Unified World Obesity Day, we were really pleased and encouraged by the level of global energy and action around it. And from cricket players on the lower right to Svetlana from WHO in the middle, and our colleagues in Mexico, Geneva missions, all over the world, we had great energy. And that's because I think all over the world, people recognize this, want to do things about it. And I think that we are probably closer to a common narrative and effective action than we may realize. So that's all, and thanks so much for listening to me. And thank you for having stuck it out through the first portion when we had technical issues. So Karina, do you want to address any questions then?
Sure, thanks very much for that fascinating talk, Johanna. That was really, I was quite blown away by the multiple aspects of narrative. I started off thinking about words, and it's about so much more than that. So thanks very much for that fascinating talk. And I'd encourage you, all of those participating today, to post your questions. And there's already quite a lot that have come in. And I'll start with in no particular order, but I'll start with some here. And what I'd like to pick up on is something that you said earlier, or indicated earlier, which is about sometimes obesity can be associated with a very positive image. Mm-hmm. There was a question here about in some cultures, and the questioner has got experience of studying in Mexico, where obesity is actually very positively associated with fertility and food security. And it's interesting because that's something very positive around the condition, and yet we also know that having obesity is a condition that is of ill health. So what is your view on how to manage that aspect of the narrative in where the perspectives on obesity are quite different?
So no, it's an excellent point, and I alluded to it when I spoke about fluffy women. So fluffy women is seen as that's a way of describing a woman who is has excess weight. It's seen as very positive, very attractive, which is great. And so I think the key has to, there's actually quite a number of countries and cultures where it's associated either with fertility, wealth, or not having a dire infectious disease too. That could be part of it as well, or just it's very attractive. I think that there the communication has to be more nuanced in terms of fine. I don't think but just that the health issues become sort of need to play in there and say, well, great, but excess weight is also a risk for other non-communicable diseases, and as such, we need to make sure you're as healthy as possible, while recognizing one can be healthier without being at sort of a perfect 25 BMI type of weight.
Great, thank you. And another one here, which is from Morgan. Thank you very much for your questions. And Morgan would like to know why it is that the whole stigma and blaming the individual, blaming the patient, has become so prevalent. Is that just our culture? Is it that our culture just blames individuals for things that happen to them, or is there something particular about obesity that makes it easy to blame individuals? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, because it was one of the things I saw with my stepbrother, as I mentioned, this sense, being blamed for it. And I think it's partly because you can see it more than you can see other things, and because so it's sort of easier. But it is very much this. To be honest, I don't know. I'm fascinated. I'll give you an example. I was interviewed on one of these talk shows where the woman who was the host was trying to be very provocative about obesity, And I kept holding my ground, and I actually thought I did a pretty good job of explaining, all the different drivers and all that. And when I went back to my Twitter, I'd gotten about 300 tweets in an hour, and they were all saying I was this stupid, reprehensible person. I mean, it was really funny. I mean, I don't care, because fine, try to, whatever. I mean, it was just, stupid yank was the nicest thing they said. But there's something about it that triggers a particularly trolling behavior, and I don't know why that is. I actually wish I could answer that better, but I almost understand it less. I answer it less confidently than I would have even a year ago, because I've seen so much of it, and I don't know why it is. It's very strange, and it's wrong. It's unfortunate. So, and it's horrible when you think about people who are living with a disease getting this kind of treatment.
So to follow up on that, then another question is, how can they, and I know that you've worked on this issue and do work on this issue with the World Obesity Federation, how can those who are living with obesity fight for support and intervention?
Well, I think by understanding there are communities now for people living with obesity, and united come together, and also know that the wider obesity community wants you at the center. I really see that, and I admire it, and I think it's important. I mean, there are organizations like ECBO in Europe and OAC, Obesity Action Coalition in the US. We have a portal for patients so that people from all over the world can come on and get information, and understand that many national organizations now are really finally, either if they're newer in working in obesity, they're bringing in people with obesity on the ground floor, which is as it should be, not sort of as an afterthought. So I would say, if you start with web resources, there's a lot of great ones, and we're happy to please get in touch with us, and we can direct you and link you.
Great, thank you. And there's another question here, which is around what the questioner calls the body positive movement, which you'll be familiar with, which of course is a very positive narrative about accepting our own bodies and so on. Clearly very positive in many ways, but there's also some challenges with it if it's ignores or perhaps sidelines the health impacts of having obesity. So how do we balance the importance of self-respect around our own bodies with the dangers of sidelining the dangers of obesity?
Hey, do you hear background noise, by the way, or no? If it's just me, then I'm fine.
No, I did hear a little bit there. I don't know where it was coming from.
Now, which is good. I guess, yeah, whatever. I'm just having so many technical issues. I think, as you're saying, the body positive movement has a lot of great qualities, and in fact, that's one thing I like. Even when I hear people saying our biggest problem is that men like fluffy women, as one person in Jamaica had said, or whatever. It's to move beyond a shame paradigm is great, but to understand, again, it's about health, and maybe a more nuanced view of what healthy looks like can be part of that there are ways to be healthy without being very thin, very low BMI.
Thank you. And some fascinating questions coming here. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to ask them all, but there's a question here from Julia about the idea of narrative and evidence being separate. She says, are they in fact co-produced? So in other words, that there's a narrative around obesity, a narrative about food and obesity as an individual lifestyle choice, and that narrative influences the type of evidence that is generated and the types of questions that are asked, and they actually reinforce each other. Mm-hmm. So narrative and evidence aren't actually separated, but they're connected. So she wants to ask your view about perhaps they're actually kind of mutually supportive in a way.
That, I think, is probably the right way of thinking about it. I think when I was having that conversation, I was a bit intimidated, and I was trying to come up with something clever to say. So I sort of treated them probably like they're more divided than they are. It's a useful way of thinking about why something can get traction even without evidence is that if the narrative is strong enough and the other ingredients are right and the platform is strong enough. But it absolutely, I think those are really important points that evidence and narrative can be very much mutually reinforcing. So yes, absolutely, I fully agree with that. Thank you for raising that.
You mentioned in your talk about sometimes the focus is so much on prevention. It can be disempowering for people who experience obesity or other NCDs or other diseases when the talk is only around prevention. But the evidence, nevertheless, is that as a kind of overarching strategy, prevention is better than cure. So Simran has a question here about that. And she's saying, what should be the balance be between prevention versus what she terms correction, and how to get that balance right, and how much focus to put on people already affected by obesity, given that reversing that situation for those individuals is so extraordinarily difficult and challenging.
Well, so first of all, I think there are actually, reversing is maybe not, but getting to a healthy weight is very possible actually, and if the conditions are right. So, but I do think that I think part of the reason I talk about the prevention feeling like a bias at times is it's more that it gets back to that silo point. So when you're advocating, political leaders in particular will say, oh yeah, we're taking care of obesity, we built a playground. Or we're taking care of obesity, we're taxing some, we're restricting junk food advertising. Great, that's necessary but not sufficient. So it's a little bit about almost the political conversation more than it is about one being right or wrong. It's more about, it's easier to build a playground and tax sugar sweetened beverages than it is to have a health system that knows how to address obesity. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't have a health system that addresses obesity, even if you do have a playground and tax sugar sweetened beverages, because you should be doing both. So that's a little bit what I would say, and that's I think often in NCDs this kind of treatment and prevention are seen as there's a false dichotomy, and again I really do think it's false, because I think most people recognize you need it both. But they can be a bit pitted against each other, and certainly in the political arena they can be as well.
Thank you. And following on the theme of interventions, how about psychological interventions, considering that obesity can also be linked with mental health conditions, and there's increasing evidence on that score. So what is your view about how we can support those kind of psychological interventions?
I think it's a great point. I think there are really interesting studies about trauma, childhood trauma and obesity for sure. That's part of it, and then even overall trauma. And then people who've grown up in conditions of stunting and undernutrition who wind up with overweight and obesity as a consequence of sort of the impact of stunting on them. So I think so there's lots of different drivers for this. Mental health is a critical pillar of any effective obesity intervention or treatment, and talking openly about it is something that I see people with obesity do and admire and think is really critical. So yes, we're supportive, and more research needs to be done and more destigmatization through talking more publicly about the mental health element of it.
There's another point here which is relevant to the coronavirus situation, which is that it seems that as a result of COVID-19, there's been a greater realization of the inflammatory response that's caused by obesity. So the question here is, could actually focusing more on those kinds of internal changes in the body be effective at moving the narrative forward, rather than just focusing on fatness, as it were?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think the key is that we don't, particularly in relation to COVID, we just don't have enough research yet to know, and it's just going to take some time to really collect that research. But it appears, certainly, I guess I should say, the mechanism for the association between obesity and complications of COVID is still not, there's lots of theories and hypotheses out there. There's not there's not enough evidence to say that there's a clear mechanism or mechanisms yet in a way, but it clearly inflammation appears to be associated with it, and it's highly possible that we'll find out more about that. I don't want to sound so hesitant, but it's too soon in the game to really know how the interplay there. But inflammatory responses are really just more broadly such an interesting and critical area. More and more it's becoming obvious that it's linked with many of these factors.
So there's time for a couple more questions, and as I said, I'm sorry I'm not able to ask all of them. You mentioned adverse childhood experiences a moment ago, Johanna, and there is a question about the link, or the fact that there's the person asking the question has experience of working with people with obesity in a health setting, and says that they know that many people have had adverse childhood experiences, adverse childhood events, and that it feels like a secret that no one wants to discuss. And it's a comment, really. But I wanted to bring it up because it was certainly, and when I learned that, it was something I hadn't really thought about before. So what can be done about highlighting, mentioning that, and dealing with that?
I think, again, it goes back to, I think that's where narrative is so important, in terms of taking the stigma element plays a measurable role in worse obesity outcomes, and internalized stigma based, is something that often is associated with adverse childhood experiences, or events. So there's, I think it's continuing to talk about it and continue to build the champions of not to design any obesity programs without people with obesity at the table. I do find it kind of interesting what's happening in the UK now, where Boris is recognizing that his own obesity seemed to have played a factor in his having complications of COVID, and has come out now with this whole new policy announcement the other day. So it's interesting because you actually do have people even in positions of political power who can potentially be unexpected advocates, through their own experience with it. Interesting. I don't want to go down the boat. I don't want to open that whole Pandora's box, but I find it very interesting what's happened in the UK in particular.
So just we are at time now, but if it allows us to go on for a couple more minutes, there's still a lot of people on. So there's just two about the local. There are two people asked separate questions which are related. How can this narrative being taken forward for people who are working in local authorities, local government, in local communities? What is the best way to start for those people, in a very practical sense, working at the local level, to start to adopt and use this narrative? Where should they start?
Well, so first of all, if those questions are coming from the UK, I would say reach, and I'm not sure if they are. Obesity UK itself is a fantastic organization. So is the Association for the Study of Obesity. But Obesity UK is very much, it's led by a woman with obesity, Sarah LeBrock. It's very focused on being local advocates. And so I would certainly, start there if you're in the UK, but also you can learn from what they're doing in other countries as well. There are fantastic organizations doing work in this space. At World Obesity, we're lucky we get to work in the sort of global level, but we've got amazing members working locally, EASO, the European Association, Obesity Society, and many national obesity organizations all across Europe. There are not many outside of sort of in the Gulf. We don't have many, but we do have a lot of great work going on the ground there too. So I think that, first of all, the Time for Obesity narrative piece, which is just a 2-page, it's open access on Lancet. Time for Obesity narrative was written about 1.5 years ago. That actually includes some simple messaging that can be helpful. But other than that, really excellent organizations working in this space. Please go to worldobesity.org, and we can connect you with your members, your national members, who can also give you the language and the messaging and partner with you.
Great, thank you. And just one final quick question about the Syndemic, the Syndemic report, Council Commission on Obesity. Do you think that has been impactful, or it's had any impact, the idea of bringing together that Syndemic narrative?
Well, I think what's interesting is so much what we're doing right now is we're actually collecting the case studies of what's going on that's syndemic-like in many different parts of the world, and finding with some really interesting case studies of what's working, what's effective, and then building kind of a resource for that. So I think it's going on, whether it's directly, overtly inspired by or modeled on sort of the recommendations of the Syndemic, whether it's something that kind of exists in parallel. That varies from case to case, but they're definitely very interesting models of how that's working. And we think as we build back better, that we'll see more more sort of need and demand for those addressing systemic issues in a coordinated way, as the Syndemic does.
Great. Well, I'll bring the Food Thinkers webinar to a close now. Thank you very much to Johanna Ralson for that fascinating talk, and for the amazingly stimulating questions. At least I found them very stimulating, and I wasn't even able to get through them all. So thank you very much for those questions. And I'm sorry to those who I wasn't able to get to, but really a very insightful set of questions as well. The next Food Thinkers webinar will be Meena Davidnam on September 24th. We'll be taking a break in August. And I apologize again for the technical hitch. We learn as we go, and that is certainly a learning experience. I'm sorry, Johanna, that you were caught up in that. But thank you very much to you, Johanna, and thank you very much to the participants. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Corinne. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.